1 Kings chapter 9 is where we're going to pick up here in just a minute. I think we're going to pick up about verse 19, if I remember right. So this is just our summer schedule. We kind of go in spurts, and I'll have to be gone next week and then be here. And then I think I got to be gone 2 straight weeks, the first 2 Wednesdays in August. And so it's not my preferred method of teaching, but it leaves us kind of choppy and hard to get a flow, but it is what it is. So we'll try and break at places that maybe won't be as difficult to pick up on. All right, so we're going to pick up here in 1 Kings 9. And what we've looked at, 1 Kings 9 verses 1 through 9 are actually just kind of a conclusion to the whole prayer of Solomon in chapter 8 and the dedication of the temple. And then when we pick up in verse 11, and it even carries on into verse 10, it's kind of a summation of Solomon. It's a summation really of some of his diplomatic policies, some of his relationships with other people. There's great testament given to his wealth in chapter 10. That's really what chapter 10 is about. And so what is happening as we're moving in this second half of chapter 9 on into chapter 10 is the overarching theme is that God has kept his promise to Solomon. You remember he asked Solomon, appeared to him in 1 Kings 3 very early in his reign, and asked him what he desired, and he asked for wisdom. And God said, well, because you've asked that, the thing that he had asked pleased the Lord, and God said, because you have asked that, I'm going to give you that no one is going to parallel you ever, other than, of course, Jesus. And then I'm going to give you the things for which you did not ask, and one of those things was wealth. And what we're seeing is that God is keeping his side of the promise, which was never in any doubt. God is always going to keep his side of the promise. But the way chapter 10 closes is that we see God keeping his side of the promise, and then we open up chapter 11, and we start asking, but did Solomon keep his side of the promise? And unfortunately, we know the answer to that. He did not keep his promise. And so that's what we're looking at as we span chapters, the second part of chapter 9 into 10 and on into 11. We're seeing that God keeps his side of the covenant. Solomon does not. And that leads to the ultimate downfall of chapter 12 in the division of the kingdom. So what we have looked at, I think, so far in this chapter, so we're at the midway point, verse 10, at the end of 20 years in which Solomon had built the 2 houses. He reigns 40 years, so we're at the midway point of his reign. And his relationship with Hiram continues, the king of Tyre. And in verses 11, 12, 13, and 14, he gifts him 20 cities in the land of Galilee, which we talked about how that was problematic because he's handing away the promised land to a foreign nation. And so there are some things problematic about that. But it does show his superiority as a diplomat. He's the chief diplomat in the world at the time. And then in verses 15 through 18, we went through, and he is refortifying the city. He rebuilt the Milo, which is this section in the wall in Jerusalem that kind of bridged the gap between the area where the new temple and palace complexes were, and then the old section of Jerusalem. So he builds that particular section. And then he moves on, and he fortifies a number of key cities that are categorized for us in 17 and 18. And if you notice their locations, the top 3, you have that coastal area. Now, Solomon is controlling. Palestine is basically a crossroads for trade. It connects different parts of the world. And so that's really good for you. If you own that land, you get a lot of tax revenue in that process. But you also have people that want to do what with it? They want to take it from you. So you have to be sure you have strong forces in place to make sure you protect your interests. And so when we read about him rebuilding these cities, that's what he's doing. He's protecting and solidifying his trade route interests. And you notice how he's systematically placing them along the coast where that trade line would go and where the trade would come in from the Mediterranean. And so he's getting it from all different types of directions. And so he's solidifying that. And then he's solidifying his interest in other ways when he builds very close to the city of Jerusalem. That's a strategic location to protect the interest of the city of Jerusalem. If an enemy gets foothold in that particular location, it makes Jerusalem extremely vulnerable from a military standpoint. He builds south toward Edom because there were some hostilities that had, of course, escalated with Edom. And so he builds there to protect those interests. And then where we pick up in verse 19, it says, "In all the store cities that Solomon had, and all the cities for his chariots, and the cities for his horsemen, and whatever Solomon desired to build in Jerusalem, in Lebanon, in all the land of his dominion." And so the basic premise is whatever Solomon wanted is what he did. If he wanted to build it, he built it. And you see the way chapter 9 begins in verse 1. It says, "As soon as Solomon had finished building the house of the Lord and the king's house, all that Solomon desired to build." And so he is so extremely wealthy and so extremely powerful. He does basically what he wants. There are really no limits upon what he can do. And so he's going through that process. Now, let's pause just for a second here in Kings and go to the book of Ecclesiastes when he writes in chapter 2 is where I want us to look for just a moment. Ecclesiastes chapter 2. Now, to preface this, the Bible has a number of subjects, well, a lot of subjects, in which you have to they hold one another in tension, so to speak. Okay? Now, a rubber band if I were to take a rubber band and just set it on this podium, that rubber band, just as it is sitting on the podium, is virtually useless, right? It's not doing anything. But if I were to take a rubber band and even just pull it on one side, it would still be pretty much useless. It would just move. For a rubber band to fulfill its purpose, it has to have tension pulling at it from multiple directions, right? Okay, now that is indicative of how we have to understand a lot of things in Scripture. There are tensions between teachings in Scripture, okay? For an example, one of the most commonly disagreed upon is the role of God and the role of man in salvation. How does that work? Those two things are taught in Scripture, but what is the proper tension at which you hold those two teachings? Okay? And a number of different ones could be given. The one we want to think about here is the premise of work. Okay, so on one side, work is something that God gave to us as a gift. Okay? In Genesis chapter 2, that was part of paradise. God created us. Part of being created in the image of God is the creative aspect that man has, his innovation, his ability to look at problems and to solve them and to come up with creative solutions. And that's part of bearing God's image to the earth. And so work is good and it is holy. And the Bible exalts work and says that work is not something that's necessarily supposed to be dreaded and hated. Although it has become complicated because of sin, that's Genesis chapter 3, when he begins the discussion with Adam for his punishment for his sin. And so the Bible exalts work. At the same time, though, on the other end of the spectrum, work can be abused. That is when we begin to, and we would never call it this, but we worship work. That work is the only thing that matters, right? I find my identity and my security in life by what I'm able to do in my job. Okay? And that gets into a dangerous realm because we're exalting work. We're looking for our fulfillment as a human being in our work instead of our fulfillment as a human being in God. And so that turns problematic, okay? And so there is that extreme that we have to be cautious of, and it's that extreme that Solomon is going to talk about here in Ecclesiastes when he's talking about in chapter 2, well, actually backs up into chapter 1 a little bit. So Ecclesiastes is like a scientific experiment. Now, I'm not good at science by any stretch of the imagination, but we all understand the scientific method, whether or not we can list the steps in the scientific method, we all use it, right? You go out to your car tonight and it doesn't work, what are you going to do? It doesn't start. Well, you're immediately going to begin to investigate what is the cause of it. Now, you're not going to sit here and think, okay, define the problem. My car doesn't work. That's an understood. It's presupposed, but that is a part of, quote, scientific method. And then we're going to see the criteria, of course, by which we would define success. Well, I got to get it working. So what do I think? I'm going to hypothesize, what do I think the problem is? And based upon the reaction of the vehicle, it might rule out certain things, right? If I can't get anything to turn over, it won't make a noise, if no lights will light up, that indicates certain things here and certain things there. So we go through that process, and we keep trying things until we arrive at the right solution to the problem, right? Okay. Now, human beings do the same thing with life. And that's what Ecclesiastes is about. Solomon says, here is the problem that is before me. What is it that brings true fulfillment in life? That's his premise. That's the question that he's going to explore. Now, in the end of chapter 1 and on through chapter 2, he's going to plug in different guesses or hypotheses by which he thinks will be the correct answer to that question. Okay? That is, if I can do this, then I will get the feeling of fulfillment and happiness. Okay? For an example, in the first part of chapter 2, in verse 1, it's pleasure. Whatever feels good, I'm going to do it. So I'm going to just live a life unrestricted. Whatever I feel like doing, that's what I'm going to do. Whatever feels good, I'm going to pursue it to the nth degree, and that's where meaning is going to be found. Of course, he comes up empty. Now, the second thing that he plugs into this question about what brings fulfillment is work. Verse 4 of Ecclesiastes 2. He said, I made great works and built houses and planted vineyards for myself. And I made myself gardens and parks and planted them in all kinds of fruit trees. I made myself pools from which to water the forest and the growing trees. These are irrigation canals. I bought male and female slaves and slaves who were born in my house, and I had great possessions of herds and flocks, more than any who had been before me in Jerusalem. And I gathered for myself silver and gold and treasure of the kings and the provinces. I got singers, both men and women, and many concubines, and the delights of the sons of man. So I became great and surpassed all who were before me in Jerusalem. All my wisdom remained within me, and whatever my eyes desired I did not keep from them. I kept my heart from no pleasure, and my heart found pleasure in all my toil. There's his work. And this was the reward of all my toil. I had a lot of stuff. Then I considered all that my hands had done and the toil I had experienced in doing it. And behold, all was vanity and striving after the wind. There was nothing to be gained under the sun. And the word translated vanity that's so often used in Ecclesiastes is the idea of trying to catch wind. It's a pointless pursuit, right? I mean, I can stand up and believe me, if any human being could ever want to catch cold air and keep it with him all the time, it would be me, okay? I sweat in a snowstorm. But it would be pointless for me to stand up in cold air. I mean, all you have to do is look. I mean, that's normal. I could be sitting at my desk and it would look just like this. So you grab stuff. Me trying to grab air, that's point. People, if you walked in one day and you saw me trying to do that, you would try and have me admitted somewhere because I'd lost my mind. But Solomon says, when you take all of these building projects that I did, and I thought that if I became the titan of industry, which, by the way, he did become the titan of industry. He was the international leader in commerce. And his wealth was unsurpassed, which we're going to see in chapter 10 in great detail. And those things in and of themselves are not bad. It was not bad for him to build a temple or to build a nice house or to have great possessions. Nothing about that was inherently wrong. It was him trying to find his identity in those things and fulfillment in those things that was wrong. Okay? And so we see Solomon telling us that work is a good thing. It's designed by God for us. And he's doing a lot of things, but one of the things that Ecclesiastes is telling us as we're reading Kings is a lot of the stuff he's doing it from the wrong position, from the wrong motive. He's doing it to gain international fame. He's doing it to try and find fulfillment, and he's never going to find it, okay? Because all of those toys can be taken and can be replaced. A massive fire can take everything you have in a moment, especially in that culture. And so that's a warning from Solomon's life that he's telling us work is a good thing, but keep it in its perspective, okay? Now, as we come back to 1 Kings chapter 9, he also moves on and he talks about the labor that he employed in some of his building projects. Verse 20, he says, "And all the people who were left of the Amorites and the Hittites and the Perizzites and the Hivites and the Jebusites that were not of the people of Israel, their descendants who were left after them in the land, whom the people of Israel were unable to devote to destruction, these Solomon drafted to be slaves, and so they are to this day. But of the people of Israel, Solomon made no slaves. They were the soldiers that were his officials, his commanders, his captains, his chariot commanders, and his horsemen." And so the individuals listed here, Amorites, Hittites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. Jebusites would have been the previous inhabitants of Jerusalem. These, you remember, were nations that were in the promised land when they came, and the children of Israel did not utterly drive them out. And so he just simply employed them and put them to slave labor, basically, because they could not drive them out, or, well, to be honest with you, they did not drive them out. It's not a matter of could, it was did, okay? But that's, and that's what Joshua told them at the end. It's going to end up being a problem for you. But he uses them. He did not use his own people for slave labor. When we were looking at the beginning of the temple building in 5 and 6, we saw that he would send his people off in rotations and he would pay them, okay? And so that's why he's making an emphasis here. His people he took care of. Slave labor he did employ, but not in the same way that he did Israelite labor. That was hired labor. Okay, now he goes a little further, detail 23. These were the chief officers who were over Solomon's work, 550 who had charge of the people who carried on the work. Now you remember at the beginning of this, we talked about how Solomon's reign was a transition. David was the warrior, okay? He expanded the borders of Israel. And here's the thing, anybody can expand borders. But if you got the organizational skills to keep them. That was one of the issues with the Roman Empire. Some of the early emperors knew that you don't go out and conquer the whole world because we literally can't police it all. Later emperors were a little more emboldened, and that's what ultimately would lead to their downfall, or at least part of it anyway. But we talked about how Solomon's challenge was not going to be a military one because he was safe. His dad had put all that stuff in position, it was ready to go. His challenge was going to be, could he now take this vast empire and could he organize it and make it run? And the answer to that was absolutely yes. He makes it run. He organized his cabinet perfectly. He had officials in the right locations and that's what we're seeing here. He's got workers here. He's got slaves here. He's got officers over them here. He has got everything fine-tuned and running well. He is an organizational or a logistics master, we might say. And so now we come to 24 when it says, Pharaoh's daughter went up from the city of David to her own house that Solomon had built for her. Then he built the Milo. And so this has been mentioned previously in chapter 7. Of course, Pharaoh's daughter was one of his early wives. Now, 2 Chronicles chapter 8 and verse 11, which is a parallel text to this one, says that the reason he built her a house separate was because she would not be allowed to live in David's house. Now, reading between the lines, the reason for that, she was a Gentile. And she could not be allowed in David's temple complex, or palace complex, so to speak. And so he built for her own special place. And of course, that shows her priority in the wives. What we're going to see later is he's got 700 of them. Okay? I mean, you got 700 wives, surely some of them are going to take priority over the other. I mean, I don't know how in the world you do that. So this also shows her place of priority. She's early, and you have to remember that an alliance with Egypt is an important alliance. So he's going to make sure he treats her well. He's got to protect that alliance with Egypt. All right, verse 25, 3 times a year Solomon used to offer up burnt offerings and peace offerings on the altar that he had built to the Lord to make his offerings with it before the Lord, so he finished the house. And so those 3 times a year, most likely reference to the 3 major feast days. All male Jews are required to be in Jerusalem on those 3 major feast days. You can read about them in Deuteronomy 16, 16, and 17. Okay? So that's basically he's being faithful to the feast. He's still on a good track. He's still being faithful to God, and things are continuing to go well for him. Then we see some more about his enterprises. Solomon built a fleet of ships at Ezion-Geber, which is near Eloth, on the shore of the Red Sea in the land of Edom. And Hiram sent with this fleet his servants, seamen who were familiar with the sea, together with the servants of Solomon. And so he builds a fleet of ships, and of course he appeals to Hiram for help. Why does he appeal to Hiram, king of Tyre, for help? Where's the city of Tyre located on a map? geographically? It's on the Mediterranean. It's up in go up a little bit. There's a little kind of thumb that comes out. That's Mount Carmel that shoots out into the Mediterranean. You go up a little bit further, and Tyre and Sidon were those two major trading cities on the Phoenician coast of the Mediterranean. And so the reason why he appeals to Tyre and gets the individuals, the experienced seamen from him, is because he lives in Jerusalem. He's a city boy. He doesn't know anything about sailing ships. So you go to the people who know how to sail ships and you have them train your people. Okay? And so and also that keeps the alliance going. Now, Ezion-Geber is right here at the very bottom. So the Red Sea is this sea at the bottom that kind of looks like two fingers that point out in these directions. Ezion-Geber is located on the right side on that particular port. And of course, you can sail through the Red Sea and get out into some open waters. And so, verse 28, it says, "And they went to Ophir and brought from there gold 420 talents, and they brought it to King Solomon." Now, Ophir is a place that's known for its gold. Throughout Scripture, it's mentioned quite a bit for its gold, the abundance of it and the quality of it. You can see it in Psalm 45:9, Isaiah 13 and verse 12, some of those places. So 420 talents of gold. Now, you remember money is measured how in this culture? How do they compute money? How do they handle money? It's not paper currency. It's weight, okay? You take a valuable metal and you put weight with it. So a talent is a measurement of weight. Now, the amount of weight put with 420 talents of gold is about 16 tons of gold. That's a lot of money, okay? That's a lot of money he's bringing in, and that's just one portion of his income. Now, in the New Testament, I think we've mentioned before, when you do the math on the New Testament side, a talent of gold New Testament time is roughly $1 million. Okay? So, just take the New Testament computation and put it in the Old Testament. That's 420 million. A little bit later, we're going to be introduced to 666 million. He's already at $1 billion in revenue yearly. Okay? And it's going to increase more than that because those are some of the only tax numbers that he's getting. Those are external taxes for using his highways and different things along that line and lands that he owns in other places. This is not the taxes that the people of Israel are paying. Okay? So, there he is. His wealth is doing well, and he's prospering. And what we're going to see in chapter 10 is more of that. We're going to see in chapter 10 the visit from the Queen of Sheba, and we'll see some things with her. And then we'll get another list at the end of chapter 10, or really verse 14 through the end. We'll run into that same list again, where we will categorize his wealth. So, any questions or anything on those before we move into 10? All right, so the Queen of Sheba, we call this section confirmation, and here's the reason why. So, Hiram has been a pretty close friend, and he sees the wealth of Solomon, and the biblical text is paying tribute to the wealth of Solomon. It's becoming well known. But with the Queen of Sheba, you have an outsider who is herself extremely wealthy in a very prosperous land as queen. And she comes to visit Solomon, and when she is done, she's absolutely blown away. She cannot believe what she has seen. And so what you have is outside confirmation of someone with really not a dog in the fight who looks at Solomon and says, I've never seen anything like this. This is wealth on a level I've never seen. This is wisdom. This is power on a level that I've never seen. And so it's a confirmation of just how much international prestige that Solomon has. Okay? So, in chapter 10, verse 1, "Now when the Queen of Sheba heard of the fame of Solomon concerning the name of the Lord, she came to test him with hard questions. And she came to Jerusalem with a very great entourage and with camels and bearing spices and very much gold and precious stones. And when she came to Solomon, she told him all that was on her mind." So she hears about this guy named Solomon. She says, oh yeah? Let's see. Because, a lot of times things are oversold, right? Assessments of certain things, of people, are oversold. So somebody says you got to go see this, you got to go behold this, travel this, and see this, or meet this person. You've got to just see their vastness of their wealth, or you've got to see the vastness of their knowledge, or you got to see this, you got to see that. And many times it's underwhelming. Okay? And so she says, okay, I'm going to see this for myself. I want to know if everything is as advertised. And so she makes a trip from Sheba, which is in the Arabian Peninsula. It's about 1,400 miles. Now, you got to remember, this is not 1,400 miles modern-day travel. So this takes a long time. This is months of travel with a huge entourage, because she's the queen, and so her life is precious. So she has to travel with a lot of army who are able to protect her, because there'd be a lot of people who would want her dead. So she has to travel with a big entourage. And so she makes this trip to hear about the wisdom of Solomon. She wants to ask him hard questions, which was a common diplomatic exchange back then. And to a degree, maybe even now. It's a little bit more strong-arming now, but back then it was testing wisdom. We're going to give you ethical questions and see what you say. We're going to give you riddles. Can you answer the riddle? We're going to give you diplomatic questions. Here's a situation that a country faces. How would you solve the problem? And the answers that the person gives tells you something about their capability. And I think we all understand that. If you put a scenario, if I were to write a scenario and put it in front of, say, a group of teenagers over here, a group of young adults right here, a group of middle-aged people, and a group of older people here, the way those groups would answer would be somewhat different. But I can guarantee you, some of those early groups, their answers would show some of the fact that they're a little bit naive about how some things work. Okay? They just don't understand the finesse of situations and how you have to handle situations. But as you move down the line, you would see some of that experience and wisdom begin to come out as the way those questions would be answered. And so what she's doing, putting him to the test, she's trying to see if it's all it's said to be. So she comes bearing spices and very much gold and precious stones. Spices, Sheba was the world leader in spices at the time. And they're pretty well known. They're mentioned in Scripture in a number of places. Jeremiah 6:20, Isaiah 60, verse 6, and Ezekiel 27:22, I think. But those are some mentions of the spices that came from Sheba and precious stones. So she brings him a gift, not uncommon diplomatic courtesies. So she told him all that was on her heart. In verse 3, Solomon answered all her questions, and there was nothing hidden from the king that he could not explain to her. So every question, he takes it and he answers it masterfully. And when the queen of Sheba had seen all the wisdom of Solomon, the house that he had built, the food of his table, the seating of his officials, the attendance of his servants, their clothing, his cupbearers, his burnt offering that he offered at the house of the Lord, there was no more breath in her. So she takes in the grand scope and scheme of everything, not just his wisdom, but also his house, his palace, which was magnificent, the food that was on his table, the vastness of the spread of it, the seating of his officials, the attendance of his servants, how well they did their jobs, the clothing that they wore. Not his clothing, the clothing that his servants wore. Okay? His cupbearers and his burnt offerings. So basically, after surveying the whole thing, she's just blown away, basically. There's no more breath in her. I've never seen anything like this. And she said to the king, the report was true that I heard in my own land, the land of your words and of your wisdom. But I did not believe the reports until I came, and my own eyes have seen it. And behold, the half was not told me. So many times things don't live up to expectation. But what she said was, the people who explained it to me didn't even do it justice. Because of who you are and the wealth that you have and your wisdom and all of the things that go forth. Now here's the thing. Solomon had gotten to this position. Unfortunately, he's going to get into the issue that all of us are in danger of, is that we get into a position, whether that's a work position, a financial position, any kind of position you want to insert into there, and you start thinking that you're the reason why you're in that position. I got here because I did blank. Listen, it's not to deny that we might have done some things, but the only reason we were able to do them was because God allowed us to do them. You know, we can boast and we can say, I worked really hard for that. And I'm not taking away from hard work. It's something that the Bible is for. But you know, what if God decides to cut off his oxygen supply for say, 3 minutes, 4 minutes, 5 minutes, 10 minutes? How much work are you going to do? How strong are you then? What do you accomplish? You see, everything that we have is, you trace it, and it's back to God, always. The strength to get up and to go and do things in the morning, he could take that away anytime he wanted to. And it's one of the most important lessons and the most humbling lessons in the world is to know that I'm wholly dependent upon God for everything. The only way I exist is because God. This is Colossians 1. By him all things consist. Everything is held together. So you get to that position, and Solomon's going to buy that lie that I'm here because of myself. Might have done some things, but the ultimate explanation doesn't lie within ourselves. So verse 8, she begins to praise Solomon and praise God. Happy are your men, happy are your servants who continually stand before you and hear your wisdom. The idea is the people who are around you are blessed. They get to hear you and they get to see you in the way you handle situations, and it's a blessing to be able to watch you. You know, there is great there is great benefit of just being around certain people. To get to watch them work, to get to watch them operate, you learn a lot of things just by watching them. And that's why, especially in the days of Jesus, the rabbi-disciple relationship was so big. You didn't go to a school and sit in a schoolhouse. You walked and traveled all throughout the country, and your disciples watched the way you interacted with merchants in the market and how you interacted with people who were despondent, how you interacted with people who were wealthy. They watched you live, and they learned from their association with you. And that's what she's saying here. The individuals who get to live and to get to hear your wisdom constantly pour forward, if they take advantage of that, they can be extremely blessed by having you around. There are advantages to be had. And then she says, blessed be the Lord your God who has delighted in you to set you on the throne of Israel, because the Lord loved Israel forever, for he has made you king so that you may execute justice and righteousness. Now this is kind of the irony of the Kings, because she hits the nail on the head. It's because God loved you. It's because God put you in this position, and he put you in this position that you could execute justice and righteousness. Now the irony is that almost no kings after this will ever do that. They don't execute justice. They don't execute righteousness. A handful of them do, but most of them don't. God put them in those positions because this is the danger of leadership positions. The dangers of leadership positions is that you get in a position and you feel like you should be served because you're in the position. Jesus destroyed that mentality and said leadership was not about what you gain from the people who follow you. It's what you invest in the people who follow you. I don't sit in this position as king for what I can get to be as being king. I sit in this position as king to serve the interest of the people of God. That's what true leadership is about. It's about investing in other people. And what, you get into leadership dynamics, and one of the major problems with these kings, other than their spiritual issues, which are primary, is that their idea of leadership is what Maxwell would call positional leadership. It's the lowest form of leadership. People follow you because they have to. You're their boss. They have to follow you. The highest level of leadership is called permissional leadership. People follow you because they want to. They follow you because they know who you are and they see what you're about and they see what you're doing and they want to follow you. And there's a world of difference between positional leadership and permissional. And that's what some of these kings are going to run into. They forget that their job is to uphold righteousness and justice. And so she also gives the king 120 talents of gold, which is 4.5 tons more of gold. A great quantity of precious stones. Never again came such an abundance of spices as these that the queen of Sheba gave to Solomon. Now quickly, Jesus picks up on this in the New Testament in Matthew 12:42. And he says, the queen of the south will rise up in judgment with this generation and condemn it, because she came from the uttermost parts of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon. And behold, a greater than Solomon is here. He's condemning the cities where Jesus did a lot of his ministry who refused to listen to him. He said, listen, it's an argument from the lesser to the greater. You have a queen who traveled 1,400 miles to go hear the wisdom of a man that I put into his heart. Here I am, the Son of God, in your presence, live in your midst, and you won't listen to me. You will not listen to me. You take for granted my presence amongst you. And so the point that Jesus makes from this story is our willingness to invest in what God says and who God is. I had a teacher who used to say all the time in school, he said, I really don't want to go to hell. He said, but I really don't want to go to hell from America. What's his point? Because I have zero excuses. We have as many Bibles as we want. We have as many churches. There are churches everywhere we could go and learn. There are ways to learn. More ways to learn than there have ever been to learn. So if I go to hell from America, I don't have an excuse. No one really does, but an American especially. She would travel 1,400 miles to hear the wisdom of a man. Unfortunately, sometimes we can't travel 14 steps across the room to pick up a Bible that collects dust. To hear not the wisdom of Solomon, but the wisdom of the Son of God. That's the challenge that she's presenting to us and that Jesus presents to us. So we'll pick up there, hopefully in a couple of weeks, and then trudge ahead.